Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering the best spells in Baldur's Gate 3. Over the past several weeks I've gone through and updated my spell tier lists, covering every single spell in the game, which yielded more than 12 hours of video. So today I'm going to go through and talk about the very best spells at each level, from cantrips through level 6 spells, so all the spells that were rated S and A tier, to give you a one-stop shop for spell selection. How I've rated these spells is very simple. Should you learn and prepare them on characters that have access to them, and if you cast them frequently, will they help you win Honor Mode? In S tier, I've placed spells that are major draws to playing a certain class. These spells are so powerful that they're the reason that you pick characters that have access to them, because these are going to be critical tools for helping you win in Honor Mode. In A tier, I've placed spells that are going to be mainstays of a character's strategy. Almost every character that has access to these spells is going to want to take them and cast them frequently, but they don't draw you to playing that class as much as the S tier spells do. In B tier, I've placed spells that are useful in certain situations. Either they're good in certain team comps or good in certain encounters, but won't be used as frequently as the spells in higher tier. And for spells in this tier and in lower tiers, I'll mention notable ones as we go through this tier list. And of course, you can refer to the individual spell level tier lists in order to get much more extensive and detailed information about all of these spells. In C tier, I've placed spells that are marginal. Either they're good for only one very specific build, or like one or two situations that come up in the game, and otherwise are mostly not going to be cast. And finally, in D tier, I've placed spells that you can pretty safely ignore for most characters with most playthroughs. Now, of course, it's worth mentioning that the ultimate criteria for what spells you pick in Baldur's Gate 3 is what you enjoy. Optimization is a tool to help you have more fun. So even if I've rated a spell that you enjoy casting low, keep casting it. Don't let this constrain your actions, but this can give you tools to allow you to build characters that do what you want more consistently. Finally, before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Tarantula for the $10 donation, Benjamin Robertson for the $50, No Nut Rushy for the $10, and Charles Cohn and Allie for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate your support. It really means so much to me. Alright, let's talk spells. We're going to begin at the beginning with the cantrips. Cantrip selection, I think, is often heavily underrated and underdiscussed in character optimization. This is an extremely important choice because although these are unassuming spells, they're always available and often very powerful. For many spellcasters, your main combat cantrip is going to be your single most common action taken across the course of a playthrough, so choosing the right ones can make your playthrough vastly easier and your characters significantly more powerful. In S tier, I've placed Booming Blade, Eldritch Blast, Guidance, Minor Illusion, Ray of Frost, and Shillelagh. Booming Blade is a brand new spell as of patch 8 for Baldur's Gate 3, and it allows you to add an additional rider effect to a melee attack. You can only use it once per action, so if you have extra attack, you can only use it once, but if you have multiple actions in a turn, like from Action Surge or Haste, you can use Booming Blade multiple times. At low levels, it gives an enemy a debuff that makes them take a d8 of thunder damage when they move, and at higher levels it does initial damage, 1d8 at level 5 and 2d8 at level 11, and then more damage when the enemy moves. Booming Blade is incredibly powerful because it is free. For any character making weapon attacks, adding a Booming Blade attack costs them absolutely nothing, because you can just do it as part of a normal weapon attack. And it uses your weapon stat, so if you're a character who's strength-based, Booming Blade will still use your strength to make the attack and do your normal weapon damage. Because it is completely free, Booming Blade would be an amazing spell even if it did almost nothing. If this spell said 1 in a million times it does 1 damage, you would still take it on almost every character because there's almost no cost to taking it. But of course, its effects are actually incredibly powerful. The additional initial damage is amazing to get every turn for free. The damage when enemies move is very powerful as well. You can shove enemies away or walk away from them to force them to run after you to trigger this extra damage. More damage for free is just incredible. Eldritch Blast is Warlock's best damage cantrip, and the best damage cantrip overall in the game. It is very powerful because there's lots of ways to boost it. So warlocks themselves have Agonizing Blast, which adds their charisma to each beam of the Eldritch Blast. And it also does 1d10 force damage. Force is very hard to resist for enemies. And as you level it up, instead of gaining additional damage dice, like most other cantrips, it fires additional beams. These can be split across multiple enemies or all fired at the same enemy, which is incredibly powerful because it gives you multiple chances to apply rider effects, things like Agonizing Blast, Radiating Orb, extra damage from spells, and so on. And also, because it gives you multiple chances to critically hit, and it tightens the damage distribution. Although 3 attacks for 1d10 damage, is the same average damage as 1 attack for 3d10 damage, like Firebolt, it is much more likely to have a damage distribution in the center of the range because you're making multiple attacks, so you're much less likely to just miss with all of the damage. That's very good, and talks about sort of our first spell selection principle, which is that in Baldur's Gate 3, you want to reduce randomness as much as possible. The enemy of optimization is randomness, and Eldritch Blast is both incredibly powerful and incredibly non-random, so it helps your characters be vastly more consistent and also do amazing amounts of damage. This cantrip is so good that often other characters will take a level of Warlock just to access it, or the Spell Sniper feat just to access it, but of course for Warlocks it's going to be your mainstay damage cantrip throughout the entire game. Guidance is on the short list for very best spells in the entire game. Having a character with Guidance in your party basically gives you an extra 1d4 on all of your skill checks for free forever. Again, this is value for free, and anything that you get for free is incredible, and since you're going to be rolling a lot of skill checks throughout Baldur's Gate, having an extra bonus on them at very low cost is amazing. Most Honor Mode parties should try to have 2 characters with Guidance, so that if one of them has something else that they want to react to the skill check with, like Enhance Ability, you can still have Guidance on the check, so having 2 characters with access to Guidance is my usual suggestion. Guidance is also nice because it's a concentration-based cantrip. There are a lot of effects that trigger off of concentrating on something, and this gives you a way to do that for free. So you can use Concentrated Blast, the Illithid power, just at the cost of a cantrip, or you can trigger the bonuses of the Ring that does extra damage when you're concentrating, just by casting something for free. So Guidance gives you some extra benefits as well, but also just the fact that it gives you free value on every skill check is amazing. Minor Illusion is probably the best out-of-combat spell in Baldur's Gate 3. When you cast it, enemies just walk towards it with no saving throw, or characters in general just walk towards it with no saving throw, which is super powerful. You can use this to group enemies together to make them more vulnerable to AoE damage or control spells. You can use it to split enemies off from their allies in order to pick them off one by one. You can use it in towns to steal things much more easily. So Minor Illusion basically has a number of uses, only constrained by the creativity of the player, and is incredibly powerful for maximizing the value of your AoE spells. I go into much more extensive detail on this spell in the expanded cantrips tier list. Ray of Frost is the general best damage cantrip. It has 60-foot range and does 1d8 damage, and then slows enemy movement speed by 10 feet if you hit with the attack. 1d8 damage is a little less than Firebolt, but Ray of Frost brings up another important principle for choosing spells in Baldur's Gate 3, which is that cold and lightning damage are the best damage types. This is because in Baldur's Gate 3, any character that's wet has vulnerability to cold and lightning damage, and it's very easy to apply the wet condition to enemies by throwing a bottle of water at them, casting Create Water, flashing a puddle of water on the ground to steam by using a fire-based attack. And then Ray of Frost will deal double damage, outpacing the damage of any other damage cantrip. In addition, the fact that if you hit an enemy with it and it targets their armor class, so you're pretty likely to hit, they just lose 10 feet of movement speed with no saving throw, is incredibly potent for a spellcasting character. Against most melee enemies, this is as good as a stun, because you can hit them, reduce their movement speed by 10 feet, and since this has 60-foot range, you can be at least 60 feet or often 90 feet away from the enemy. They will then have to double move to try to get to you, spending both their movement and action, and they won't even cross half of that 90-foot distance in order to make up the difference with Ray of Frost, so you can use this to kite enemies backwards and stun them turn after turn when you use it against melee enemies, while dealing incredible damage. It also is cold damage, which means that it can freeze pools of water on the ground, creating an ice surface. Once again, in Baldur's Gate 3, the ability to do cold damage and create an ice surface is ludicrously powerful. When an enemy is on an ice surface, they have to make a dexterity saving throw when they move, or they fall prone. An enemy who falls prone on their turn skips the rest of their turn, so it effectively stuns them. So from this cantrip, you get multiple ways to stun enemies, often in an AoE, as well as the highest damage cantrip in the game, when enemies are wet. So with any source of the ability to make water, which bottles of water are common, create water as a level 1 spell, Ray of Frost just becomes incredible, and even without that, it's still going to help you immensely against melee enemies. Shillelagh, which, yes, is how it's pronounced, is Druid's best damage option, giving you an extremely powerful melee attack. This sets the base damage of your weapon to 1d8, so if combined with a torch, which is a club, that's on fire, you add a d8 plus a d4 of fire damage plus your wisdom to the attack, which actually gives Druid using Shillelagh the best early game melee weapon. One of the great things about Druid is that they're the strongest character in the game from levels 1 through 4 or so, which of course is the most difficult and dangerous part of honor mode runs. So having a cantrip, which are generally most important in the early game, that carries the most difficult part of an honor mode run is incredibly powerful. Shillelagh gives you that because it just gives you massive melee damage output with your druid alongside of all of the powerful spell casting that they get and wild shaping ability and things like spike growth that also win early game encounters. So this is an extremely powerful tool for an honor mode party. In A tier, I've placed Blade Ward, Bone Chill, Firebolt, Friends, Light, Mage Hand, and Toll the Dead. Blade Ward is a purely defensive cantrip, and so you won't want to cast it every turn, because often it is better to spend your turn attacking enemies. But there's two incredibly powerful uses for Blade Ward, which gives you resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. One of which is to buy time. If you spend your action and take basically half of the action of many enemies, then that can be a powerful action economy trade. Spending your action to reduce the damage of 5 or 6 enemies by 50% is like you spent your action to stop 3 of those enemies from acting. So in cases where one character is about to be attacked by a bunch of enemies, Blade Ward is very powerful. It can also give your characters an emergency button if they are surrounded by enemies and need to survive until help arrives. The other thing is it's incredibly synergistic with other sources of damage reduction. The resistance applies before flat damage reduction, so a character in heavy armor or with an effect like Arcane Ward can use Blade Ward to multiply their damage reduction immensely, and enemies won't be able to hurt them. Bone Chill is another mainstay damage cantrip. 60-foot range, targets enemy AC, and does a d8 of necrotic damage, which is pretty good, and then also has a powerful rider effect. It prevents healing and gives undead disadvantage on all their attacks for 1 turn. Preventing healing is very relevant in some fights throughout the game, and Act 2 has tons and tons of undead, and there's other undead elsewhere. Being able to give them disadvantage on all their attacks with no saving throw with just a cantrip is very powerful. This also, of course, doubles up with death clerics and stuff like that, but Bone Chill is a great second damage cantrip. Typically, you're going to want one other damage cantrip as your main damage source, but Bone Chill will be a very powerful utility effect to have access to. Firebolt does a d10 of fire damage, and while this is more damage at base than Ray of Frost, typically, Firebolt is going to be more of a utility spell than a direct damage spell. Usually, when you have a choice between these two, Ray of Frost is going to be more damage and have more utility options, so you'll usually cast it more. But Firebolt lets you set fires. Being able to light things on fire at long ranges is incredibly useful throughout Baldur's Gate 3. And of course, you can also cast it on an enemy when you want damage. So this is the highest damage direct damage cantrip, so in cases where enemies aren't wet and you can't double the damage of Ray of Frost, Firebolt is a little more damage on average, but also just being able to light fires is incredibly valuable. Friends gives you advantage on charisma checks, which are generally speaking the most important checks that you're going to make throughout Baldur's Gate 3. And so having free advantage on those is incredibly powerful, just like with guidance. However, on Honor mode and Tactician mode, Friends also counts as committing a crime. So when the duration expires, enemies will treat you as though you committed a crime, which can either cause you to go to jail or be attacked, depending on the area that you're in. There's a way around this, which is to fast travel away from the location that you used Friends in and wait out the duration. You can also hide or disguise in order to get away from it. This takes real-life actual time in order to avoid the downsides of this spell, but it's still a very, very powerful tool. A lot of the charisma checks that you're going to make in the game are against enemies that you're going to fight anyways, so even if you're not metagaming, then Friends is still a very powerful tool, so even if you don't like doing the fast travel away and then come back thing, it's still an incredibly powerful tool and will give you huge advantages in a lot of circumstances. Light is the definition of a perfect utility cantrip. You cast it once at the beginning of the day, and it makes your character glow with light. There's lots of areas in the game where you need extra light sources, and the ability to do this with a cantrip is probably the best way to get light sources in the game. You can also cast it on a weapon and then put that weapon away or drop it if you want to turn off the lights for whatever reason in an area. So a very powerful and useful tool, especially because there's so many areas in Baldur's Gate 3 where it's important to have them lit. Mage Hand is available only on a short rest cooldown, so it's the only cantrip in the game that has an actual cooldown, but it is ridiculously strong. Because the Mage Hand can throw objects, if you drop a stack of throwables, like water bottles, healing potions, or grenades on the ground, then you can do that without spending an action, and the Mage Hand can throw them for you. Having the Mage Hand throw water bottles to get enemies wet or healing potions to keep your allies active is incredibly powerful and allows you to do those things, which are great in Baldur's Gate 3, without spending valuable time from your actual characters. You do need to be a little bit careful if you want it to throw grenades. You can do that, but enemies will attack stacks of explosives or alchemist fire or stuff like that on the ground, so if your character is too near it, they might be able to blow them up, so you do need to be careful with that, but Mage Hand gives you a tremendous amount of tactical options, even though it's the only cantrip that costs an actual cooldown in order to use. Finally, Toll the Dead is the best damage cantrip for clerics. It's a new spell that was introduced in patch 8, and it single-handedly has made clerics early game already pretty good, significantly stronger by giving them a great direct damage option in the early game. Of course, especially for death clerics who can double up on it, it's amazing, but for any cleric, just having a direct high damage cantrip gives them valuable things that they can do with their turns while they're also concentrating on the extremely important concentration spells that are clerics' bread and butter. So Toll the Dead gives them just an excellent default action to take turn after turn, and is going to be the damage cantrip that almost every cleric is going to use. For characters that have access to Toll the Dead, but also have access to other damage cantrips like Ray of Frost, Bone Chill, and Firebolt, you're typically going to want to use those instead, but for clerics, this is their best option, and so that's what they're going to take over everything else available to them. Finally, a couple cantrips from lower tiers that are worth mentioning for various reasons. One is resistance. There's a few cases in the game where you have guaranteed saving throws that you're going to have to make. Either there's a saving throw in dialogue when someone or something tries to mind control you, or there are saving throws that you know you're going to have to make, and resistance will allow you to respond to those triggers by boosting your character's saves, which is very powerful. So this is one that you should usually strive to have in a party, even if you won't use it that often. It also is a concentration cantrip, just like guidance, so it can be used for all the concentration shenanigans, though typically most characters who have resistance also have guidance, and so are just going to use guidance for that instead. But resistance gives you some combat benefits, so if you are using it to trigger concentration, it's not a terrible way to do that throughout the fight. Also, Sacred Flame I actually moved from my updated tier list where I had it in D tier up to C tier, specifically for Radiating Orb builds. This spell is significantly worse than Toll the Dead in terms of its damage output in the early game, so clerics are going to avoid Sacred Flame and take Toll the Dead instead, almost always. But once you get into the later game and have the Radiating Orb gear, radiant damage becomes very relevant, and so while cantrips will be much less of an important part of your plan in the late game, those builds will still sometimes cast Sacred Flame, so I'm putting it in C tier. Finally, Bursting Sinew is the other new cantrip available in patch 8. Unfortunately, the targeting restrictions on this spell and the just overall damage, the fact that it targets a dexterity saving throw, just make it hard to actually land the damage from Bursting Sinew, although it is really fun. So unfortunately, despite being a new cantrip, this one is going in D tier. Overall, your goal with cantrips is going to be to have powerful default actions that you can take in combat so that you can do them turn after turn after turn, and free utility that helps out your entire party. And so things like Guidance, Light, and Minor Illusion give you massive advantages for very little or no resource expenditure, and these spells will be important mainstays for strategizing both in and out of combat. Next up, let's talk about first level spells. These are in many ways the most important spells that you're going to select and cast throughout your playthrough, because you start the game with them and have them all the way through, so they're going to be the most numerous spells that you cast. Also important to remember is that every spell of a higher level is competing directly against these spells, because you can always spend a higher level spell slot to cast a lower level spell. And a lot of the time, the best use for higher level spell slots is going to be upcasting these incredibly powerful spells. A very common play pattern for a spellcaster is to cast a powerful concentration spell with their highest level spell slot, and then spend the rest of the fight casting lower level spells to finish off enemies, and then finally finishing off on cantrips in order to conserve resources. And first level spells are going to make up the bulk of that, so these spells are going to be cast many times per fight compared to higher level spells, which may not be cast as often. In S tier, I've placed 13 first level spells. We're going to start with Bless, which is an incredible buff spell that makes your whole party better at rolling dice. It adds a d4 to your attack rolls and saving throws, and rolling dice is basically the whole game. That's what you do in Baldur's Gate 3, and attack rolls and saving throws are the most important kinds of dice that you're going to roll by far. So Bless makes you better at doing the thing that composes the entire game of Baldur's Gate 3. It decreases randomness and means you're much more likely to succeed on everything that you're attempting to do, making it an extremely powerful effect. And because it lasts for 10 turns, you can cast it before combat starts and never have to actually spend an action on using Bless. Most parties should strive to have this buff running, either by casting the spell or using items that grant it, 100% of the time. It's that powerful when you are playing through the game. Chromatic Orb is the best level 1 damage spell, because not only is it sort of the gold standard for damage with 3d8 thunder damage or 2d8 of any other damage type, you can choose which damage type you are selecting, which is very important because it's going to let you hit vulnerabilities and avoid resistances very easily. It also leaves behind an elemental surface of the appropriate type, which can be guaranteed damage if it's fire or lightning, can reduce enemy armor class if it's acid, making them easier to hit, and most importantly, can be an ice surface. I've already mentioned how powerful ice surfaces are, but Chromatic Orb dealing 2d8 cold damage, which can be doubled using the wet condition for 4d8 damage with a level 1 slot, great damage to spell slot ratio. And then leaving behind an ice surface, which can often stun one or multiple enemies, gives it an incredible top end and incredible versatility. So this is just the best level 1 damage spell, and when you're not casting concentration spells, you're often going to be casting Chromatic Orb. It also can critically hit, targets armor class, so it's got basically everything going for it. Command is the best control spell for single targets, and often the best control spell for multiple targets, because when you upcast it, you get an extra target for every spell level beyond the first. It lets you effectively trade your turn for an enemy turn, which is a good trade because you can decide when to do it. But also with Command Grovel, not only do they lose their turn, they also fall prone, and then you get advantage on your attacks against them. Its non-concentration can be extended if you're a sorcerer, so for clerics who have access to command, this is going to be one of the most common spells that you cast, because it just ends fights immediately. Taking down an enemy for a full turn means that if you won initiative, you get your whole party to attack them and then hit them with command, and then they don't do anything for a turn. You get your whole party to attack them again. So it basically buys you 2 full turns of attacks with no retaliation as long as you're winning initiative. And that is something that's very important in Baldur's Gate 3. This spell just ends fights immediately. It's probably going to be you're probably going to be spending almost every spell slot on your cleric on command because it's just that powerful, and it works so well in every fight where it's relevant, and it targets almost every enemy successfully. Create Water might seem like an odd one to be this high on the list because it's a pure utility spell, but the ability to make water anywhere is incredibly valuable. Not only are there story events and stuff where that's useful, and dousing fires and so on is really good, but as I've mentioned previously, when you get an enemy wet in Baldur's Gate 3, they take double damage from cold and lightning, and that is the most dangerous thing that you can inflict on enemies. There's a reason that in Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop game, that's not a thing, because giving enemies vulnerability to damage completely breaks the balance of the encounters, and Create Water lets you do that for extremely cheap, letting you kill enemies much, much faster than was intended and end fights before they begin. In addition to that, it leaves behind a big water surface, which is very powerful as well because that lets you create an ice surface anywhere, and ice surfaces, as we've discussed already, are great. Getting enemies wet is extraordinarily powerful in Baldur's Gate 3. It's not just for fan fiction, and taking advantage of Create Water will let you win vastly more fights than you would otherwise. Dissonant Whispers is both an extremely strong damage spell, or a reasonably strong damage spell, does good damage, direct damage to a single target, 60-foot range, but also is 2 turns of crowd control for a single saving throw. Enemies make a wisdom save or they become feared and can't move. And against melee enemies, a melee enemy that can't move is not a threat because they can't get to you. So not only does this do pretty good damage for the spell slot, it also will let you lock down melee enemies and is a spammable spell for your bard who's probably concentrating on a powerful control spell as well. So you can lock down whoever was missed by your hypnotic pattern or whatever with Dissonant Whispers. It's one of the best spells for casting turn after turn after turn. Enhanced Leap is a ritual spell, meaning that when you cast it outside of combat, it doesn't take a spell slot to cast. It triples the jump distance for your characters, and every character in Baldur's Gate can jump as a bonus action. Casting Enhanced Leap on your party is basically like giving your whole party Misty Step for free. Even a character with very low strength can jump incredibly long distances with Enhanced Leap, and mobility is king in BG3 combat because an enemy who can't reach you can't hurt you. Being able to jump up to get to ranged enemies or jump up onto height to get away from melee enemies lets you win so many fights that would otherwise be difficult basically for free, and Enhanced Leap is free because it costs you nothing to use if you cast it before combat starts. Healing Word is a bonus action heal with 60-foot range, and the healing itself is not that powerful, but the ability to get downed enemies back up off the ground with just a bonus action is really good, and the ability to apply or reapply the buff on heal items with a bonus action is excellent as well. The great thing about this spell is that it takes very little out of your action economy. You can think of Dungeons & Dragons combat as an exercise in using the resources that you get every turn to the maximum and reducing your enemy's ability to do the same. Every character in D&D combat gets 5 resources every turn: your action, your bonus action, your reaction, your concentration, and your movement. And Healing Word is one of the best ways to use your bonus action for a huge advantage. In Baldur's Gate 3, there's items that buff your allies when you heal them, and Healing Word lets you apply those as a bonus action. And then also, it lets you get allies who have been knocked unconscious back up off the ground for free, or even you can use it as an actual heal to prevent an enemy from going, an ally from going down to the next enemy attack. But mostly you're using it in order to apply these buffs and pick up downed allies, which is a very valuable tool to have. Hex and Hunter's Mark add additional damage to each of your attacks, including spells for Hex and only for weapon attacks for Hunter's Mark, and are how Warlocks and Rangers do damage. A Warlock with Hex and Agonizing Blast and Eldritch Blast is applying the Hex damage and the Agonizing Blast damage to each one of the beams of their Eldritch Blast, and so is doing a significant amount of additional damage. In the early game, this is going to be absolutely critical for your Warlock to have reasonable damage output. Late game, you may replace Hex because you will want to be concentrating on higher level spell effects, because this does take your concentration. But something that only takes one spell slot lasts all day because you can keep recasting it and increases your damage over the course of a day enormously is extremely valuable, especially in the early game. For Warlocks in particular, this also lets you turn a short rest resource, a Warlock spell slot, into a long rest benefit, because Hex can be maintained as long as you maintain concentration on it. So that lets you convert your resources into more valuable effects. Hunter's Mark is very similar, and Ranger spells are less impactful overall than Warlock spells, so this for a Ranger is just free damage. Every Ranger is going to want to use Hunter's Mark because it just increases their damage significantly. Longstrider is probably the number one spell in the game. I know I've mentioned a couple spells that are shortlisted, but this is another ritual spell that does not require a spell slot when used outside of combat, lasts all day with no concentration, and increases your the target's move speed by 10 feet. Extra move speed is incredible, lets you get to enemies before they can attack you and attack ranged enemies more easily, and maintain distance away from melee enemies so that they can't hit you. So extra move speed often directly translates into fewer turns taken by your enemies and more effective turns taken by your party, where you're not wasting actions on moving to the enemy because you're already there. Longstrider is completely free. All that it requires you to know is just to have the spell available to your party, and if you cast it on your whole party member, you get an enormous and very impactful benefit for absolutely no cost. Anything that comes for free is really good, so even if this was a much smaller benefit, it would still be an excellent spell, but as is, it costs you nothing and gives you a huge benefit, so you would be a fool not to use it. Magic Missile never misses. It's fully reliable damage unless the enemy specifically has the shield spell, which is very few enemies in the game, and being able to 100% count on doing damage to an enemy or multiple enemies, because you get multiple missiles and can split them up across multiple targets, is extraordinarily useful. As I've mentioned already several times, the enemy of optimization is randomness, and Magic Missile is entirely non-random. There is a very small amount of variance in the amount of damage that you do, but if you're worried about that, you can just put multiple missiles on the same target. And so for finishing off low health enemies, this is an absolutely guaranteed way to manage that. It also doesn't require line of sight or anything along those lines. You don't have to be able to draw a direct line to the target. You just choose someone, click on them, and they die. Magic Missile is also incredibly synergistic with lots and lots of items and build progressions in the game, and you can build entire builds around just blowing enemies up with this spell. I've done several of them on the channel, because it fires multiple missiles, and so each of those is going to apply additional damage riders and stuff that you have on your spells. But even just by default, the fact that this spell just always works makes it incredibly valuable, and you're going to use it very regularly for killing enemies who are left at small amounts of health after you've hit them with an AoE damage spell, or after an attack has rolled lower damage than you were expecting, or whatever. Sanctuary is a bonus action that makes an ally completely immune to being directly attacked for 10 turns as long as they don't attack or do damage. This can be used both reactively to defend allies who are in trouble and keep them alive, which is very, very valuable, or proactively, when you have a character who's concentrating on a valuable concentration spell like Haste. Putting them in Sanctuary means that they are almost entirely unlikely to drop concentration on that spell. And so the combination of Sanctuary and Haste, it gives you free haste without any of the downsides of that spell. So this spell is both one of the best defensive tools in the game. When you find a character in trouble, you can use Sanctuary and it will almost always get them out of it, and also gives you a lot of tactical options. You can also use it to group enemies because they'll tend to gather around the Sanctuary target. So you can use it to set up for AoE attacks. You can use it to safely get an ally out of combat. You can use it to disengage from fights that are going badly. There's all kinds of different ways that you can use this creatively. You can also use it to stand an ally in a doorway to make an immovable wall that enemies can't get past. So there's lots of things that you can do with Sanctuary, but just the fact that it gives you complete immunity to direct attacks from enemies is an absurdly powerful effect, and it only costs you a bonus action, no concentration. This spell can be used constantly and incredibly. Shield is the best defensive reaction in the game. It gives you +5 to your armor class for the entire round in which you use it. You will always negate at least one attack when you use it, so often you're just trading your reaction and a first level spell for the enemy's entire turn. And then frequently that +5 AC will make multiple attacks in a turn miss as well. This spell is great because it costs you a fraction of a resource, so your reaction, which you aren't always using profitably, for an enemy's main action. So you trade up significantly in terms of action economy, and it also, of course, keeps your characters alive. This can be used with low AC characters, who enemies will attack preferentially to cause those enemies to waste attacks by missing. It can be used with high AC characters to give them incredibly high AC that prevents enemies from ever actually touching them. Shield just has a tremendous amount of uses and will always trade favorably in terms of actions, making it incredible. In A tier, I've placed 10 more spells, and we're going to start with Armor of Agathis. This is a Warlock spell that, again, lets you trade a short rest resource, Warlock spell slots, for a long rest benefit, temp HP and damage return all day. Now, Armor of Agathis at its base rate of 5 HP and 5 damage return is not great, but this spell upcasts extremely well and synergizes extraordinarily with things that give you damage reduction. So if you have armor that reduces incoming damage, if you have resistance like Blade Ward, that'll increase and multiply both the defensive abilities of the temp HP from Armor of Agathis and the offensive abilities. It both keeps your characters alive and progresses your game plan by doing damage. It's cold damage, so it can be doubled. Works incredibly well with Abjuration Wizards, of course, because they can reduce incoming damage to 0, but even for any other Warlock, just casting Armor of Agathis makes your Warlock significantly more survivable all day. Disguise Self has enormous amounts of utility throughout the game, both in terms of story events, because there's lots of times where disguising yourself as a certain race will come up in the storyline. It can also give you cheaper prices at merchants, because they are more favorable towards members of their own race, so you can disguise as the same race as a merchant to get cheaper prices. And also, very importantly, Disguise Self gives you the ability to use weapons and items that are restricted. If you want to use the Dwarven Thrower, you can disguise as a dwarf and get the full benefits of the Dwarven Thrower, or the many items that care about being a Githyanki that are available in the game. So this spell just gives you a lot of powerful items available for any character, as well as all of the story and out-of-combat utility that this spell has. Ensnaring Strike is a ranger spell that's made as part of an attack and locks an enemy in place, preventing them from moving and giving you advantage on their attacks. That's a very powerful effect, and it's made better because rangers have access to the Bounty Hunter class feature that gives enemies disadvantage on the saving throws against Ensnaring Strike. Against melee enemies, they will almost always fail the save in the early game, and then even if you have a relatively low wisdom ranger, because disadvantage is really powerful, especially early game, and then they'll be locked in place and easy prey for your allies. Against melee enemies in particular, this is devastating, because a melee enemy that can't move is, again, not a threat. But this is just a very powerful effect overall. The main downside is it takes your concentration, so you have to give up Hunter's Mark for it, but against certain enemies, Ensnaring Strike is just going to win the fight outright. Find Familiar has an enormous number of uses, limited pretty much only by the creativity of the player using it. You can use this to scout. You can use it to set up for sneak attacks. You can use it to attack with, because the familiars themselves actually have pretty good attacks, and you can use it to absorb attacks from enemies. You can also use it to do things like heal your allies. Dropping a healing potion on the ground and having the familiar attack it will heal creatures who are in the radius of the healing potion, so you can do that without spending an action, and there's a ridiculous number of other uses. You can also buff the familiars pretty effectively. There's lots of ways to buff your summons, and when you have enough of those stacked on a familiar, even a relatively weak creature like the familiars can be pretty powerful. The Raven can fly, so it can fight anywhere on the battlefield. Gives you just an absurd number of options. The main downside is that you have to micromanage it, and not every player is going to want to do that, but if you're a player who loves using summons, Find Familiar is going to be an incredible one for you, and you know if that's you. Fog Cloud will blind enemies in the radius with no saving throw. So you put down the Fog Cloud and every creature inside of it is blinded, and that has no saving throw at all. That gives you advantage on attacks against them and gives them disadvantage on attacks. So you'll always get at least one turn of advantaged attacks when you use Fog Cloud. There's also lots of enemies in the game who can't move, and so you can put Fog Cloud on top of them and they have permanent blindness. And if you can lock an enemy in place with another control spell with Fog Cloud on top of them, they're always going to be blinded as well. It also gives you a place to hide, so you can use it to steal stuff in cities and in out-of-combat areas, because characters inside of it count as unlit. So you can hide in the Fog Cloud and steal things, and NPCs won't be able to see you, but mostly this is just a no-save blind, and anything without a saving throw is very, very powerful, even if it's a relatively small debuff like a blind, because when you don't have to roll dice, you know it's always going to work. Grease is basically a large ice surface that you can summon on demand. Enemies on it will have to make a dex save or fall prone, and if they move on it, they'll have to make a dexterity save or fall prone. And if they fall prone on their turn, they lose the rest of their turn. So Grease effectively will stun a lot of enemies. It's a very large AoE, and this actually would be a vastly more powerful spell if it wasn't for one drawback, which is that it's flammable, which actually matters a lot in Baldur's Gate. There's a lot of random fire damage that will set the Grease on fire. But when you can keep this spell on the ground and not have it get set on fire, enemies will just be slipping and falling constantly, and a giant AoE non-concentration stun on an entire encounter is obviously ridiculous. So the best case scenario for this spell is amazing. And it's not that hard to arrange the best case or something close to the best case pretty frequently. Ice Knife is basically the ice version of Chromatic Orb without the other modes. It does a little bit more damage and has the same ice surface effect as Chromatic Orb. Losing the versatility does weaken this spell, but that's the mode that you're going to use Chromatic Orb in the vast majority of the time anyways, because the ice mode is typically going to be the best one. So Ice Knife is still a great spell. Characters that have access to both of these are going to prefer casting Chromatic Orb, but if you are casting Ice Knife, that's a very respectable damage spell to be casting. Mage Armor is a day-long non-concentration buff that sets a character's base armor class to 13. So for characters who don't want to wear any form of armor, Mage Armor will give them significantly increased armor class. The way to think of this spell is actually not really as a defensive buff though, but as an offensive buff. It lets your wizards and sorcerers and stuff wear robes that give them bonuses to their spell save DCs and offensive bonuses, while not sacrificing armor class. So Mage Armor is very valuable for those characters once you get access to the gear that takes the maximum advantage of it. In the early game, it's kind of expensive to spend a level 1 spell slot on this spell just for a small bonus to AC. But in the late game, a level 1 spell slot, a much less important resource, you're going to want to have this running all the time so you can take advantage of the incredibly powerful robes that are available to your spellcasters. Also important is that Mage Armor can be cast on summons, some of whom have lower than 13 base armor class in order to boost their AC, and things like wild shape forms as well, though that won't work on most wild shape forms, but it is a very powerful tool for buffing your allies as well. Mostly you're using this to power up your wizards and sorcerers without making them incredibly squishy, and typically you're going to be using it mostly in the late game when it's less expensive, but that's still a very powerful effect, because those armor sets are so good. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a single target complete disable, prevents enemies from doing anything. But every time that they take damage, they get to make another save against it. So compared to other single target disables, it's a little bit less reliable, but it can last for up to 10 turns, and being able to lock down an enemy for a really long time, of course, is very powerful. The other key with Tasha's Hideous Laughter is that For a lot of bosses that have immunity to disables and crowd control effects, for whatever reason, are not immune to Tasha's. So there's plenty of bosses that hold person or hold monster doesn't work against, but Tasha's does. And for those enemies, it's by far the best spell to cast against them, because it will lock them down completely and prevent them from acting. In the late game, the extra saves that enemies get against this don't matter, because your save DC will be high enough that they'll fail those saves anyways. So you can use this especially alongside things like Arcane Acuity that stack your save DC higher in order to lock down enemies. But in general, this is just a really powerful level 1 disable spell that can lock down an enemy who's otherwise immune to crowd control, and that, of course, is really good. Thunderous Smite is the best of the Paladin Smite spells. You spend your bonus action alongside your attack in order to do 2d6 thunder damage, which is worse than just spending the level 1 spell slot on Paladin's normal Divine Smite in terms of damage output, but it also knocks enemies backwards, it's thunder damage, which is relevant, and most importantly, can be done at the same time as a Divine Smite if you have 2 spell slots to spend on it. So a Paladin can use a Smite attack and a Thunderous Smite in the same turn. How you do that is cast Thunderous Smite and have your Smite spell set to react, to prompt you when you want to react, and then you react by smiting as well. And that lets you get an enormous amount of burst damage out in a single attack. While it does cost 2 spell slots, that's often a really good trade, because if that just kills an enemy outright, then that's 1 fewer enemy that you have to face in that encounter. So it'll be less expenditure of resources overall when you can kill an enemy right away. The amount of burst damage that you can get by stacking Thunderous Smite and a normal Smite is excellent, and the damage type is relevant. Not a lot of enemies resist thunder damage. There's plenty of effects that care about thunder damage. Knockback is relevant. You can push enemies off of cliffs with it. Mostly, though, you're going to be stacking this with a normal Smite for as much damage in one attack as possible. A couple important spells to keep in mind from lower tiers as well. Featherfall is great for traversal around the map. Shield of Faith is nice for characters that don't have anything else that they want to concentrate on. It's just a day-long buff that takes your concentration, but if you're playing a paladin or something that isn't going to be concentrating on many spells, this can be a pretty valuable use of a level 1 spell slot to give you a day-long benefit. And Witch Bolt is very, very powerful for builds that are built around maximizing it, because that will let you deal the most lightning damage to a single target. You can check out my one-shot Lightning Lord builds for an expansion on those. Sleep is also very good to keep in mind in the early game, because while enemies will quickly outscale this, it has no save, so it's very strong in the early game, which is the hardest part of the game. So that's the level 1 spells. The main thing with level 1 spells is they give you a tremendous amount of utility, and also a lot of free benefits that will just last all game with things like Enhanced Leap and Longstrider, as well as being your go-to spell slot for when you have used a powerful concentration spell from a higher level and want to conserve resources. Level 1 spells are always there for you, and they really do get the job done. Second level spells, which you get at 3rd level for most characters, are where spellcasters really become spellcasters. This is where you get the AoE damage that lets you blow up big groups of enemies and encounter winning effects that let you end fights before they start. This is why you have spellcasters in your party, is for the types of spells that start showing up mostly at level 2. In S tier, I've placed Aid, Cloud of Daggers, Darkness, Hold Person, Misty Step, Shadow Blade, Spike Growth, and Spiritual Weapon. Aid increases the hit point total of your entire party, and if you have summons, then it will increase their hit points as well. So if you have extra characters in your party, then this multiplies in value significantly. These are real hit points, so they can be healed back up, making your entire party vastly more resilient. In general, with Aid, what I like to do is spend my 2nd highest level spell slot on this spell. You can also cast it using a character who remains at camp and get it effectively for free, but even if you're casting it with an active party member, this is a very powerful tool, because it just makes your whole party significantly more survivable, and multiplies in value the more characters and units that you have on the field, which of course is even better when you're playing a summon-focused party. Cloud of Daggers is the gold standard damage spell in Baldur's Gate 3. It does its damage both when cast and at the beginning of enemies' turns, so you're going to double dip on the damage before enemies go, and there's no saving throw on this damage. It also does its damage very reliably, because it's done as 4d4, which is an average of 10 damage, but because it's rolling a lot of small dice, again, the distribution is going to be very close to the center. So this does an average of 20 damage and is usually going to do something very close to actually 20 damage before an enemy takes their turn. Not only does this make it extremely reliable, reduce randomness, and it's AoE so you can get lots of value, this also makes it the best single target damage spell available at level 2 as well. Only 2 spells at level 2 do more damage, Moonbeam, which does 22 on average, and Scorching Ray, which does 21. But both of these have hit rolls or saving throws. Cloud of Daggers does almost as much damage, 100% reliably, is AoE as well, so you can use this, and of course if you can keep enemies inside it, they'll continue to take that damage every turn. Darkness is one of the most game-winning strategies in Baldur's Gate 3, because when you're in a darkness cloud, enemies can't target you with ranged attacks, and there's no save or anything against this. Complete immunity to an entire category of attacks is obviously absurd, and there are plenty of ways to gain blind immunity or be a warlock who can see through magical darkness, or now a shadow sorcerer, in order to take maximum advantage of this effect. When you're maximizing the use of the darkness spell, you are immune to ranged attacks, have advantage on attacks against all enemies, and all enemies have disadvantage on attacks against you, so melee enemies will have disadvantage, which obviously over the course of a game is going to prevent thousands of damage dealt to your party, giving you just a tremendous amount of benefits. Even if you aren't building around this, this is still a really good spell that comes up a lot, but this is just one of the most broken strategies and build around strategies in Baldur's Gate 3. Hold Person is a direct single target disable, and this is the most debilitating condition in the game, so if you can apply this reliably, it's always the best thing to apply, because it not only completely prevents enemies from doing stuff, it also gives you guaranteed critical hits against them from within 10 feet. Doubling all your damage against an enemy is ridiculous, so not only is this a great lockdown spell, it's also one of the best burst damage spells in the game, because when you hit an enemy with it, the rest of your party will get automatic crits, doing potentially hundreds of points of damage, even before this spell actually costs enemies turns. The downside, of course, is that it can be limited in who it targets, and they get saves to break out of it at the end of each of their turns, but one turn of Hold Person will be enough to win an encounter anyways, so this spell just ends fights immediately. It's the best thing to apply with Arcane Acuity when you have infinite save DCs and so on, just a spell that will help you one-shot encounters instantly. Misty Step is a bonus action teleport. It's the game's best mobility tool and will just get you out of trouble or get you where you need to go. No questions asked at all. This is very useful for leaving fights that are going badly, getting to where your characters need to be or away from where you don't want them. It helps especially when you're newer to the game, because this will cover for a lot of positioning errors that you might be making with your party. So if you're newer, or if you're playing while tired, or having had a beer after a long day at work, Misty Step will solve a lot of the problems that you might create for yourself just by letting you put yourself somewhere else immediately. Every character should try to have access to Misty Step, either as a spell known or through the items that give it to you. Shadowblade is another new spell that was added in patch 8, and it gives you a very powerful weapon for the entire day. This weapon does psychic damage and has advantage when you are in an obscured or unlit area, so it's already really good, and the amount of damage that it does is really high, better than pretty much any other equivalent one-handed weapon. It can also be upcast for even more powerful versions, up to 4d8 psychic damage per swing on the Shadowblade, and it synergizes with an item called the Resonant Stone that just sits in your inventory and gives everyone near you vulnerability to psychic damage, and obviously vulnerability is incredibly powerful. But even without that incredibly broken combo, and let's not lie, that combo is absurdly strong, even without that, Shadowblade is just a very, very powerful spell. It gives you an incredibly strong source of consistent damage for any character that's making weapon attacks. It's just better than most other one-handed weapons that you could have access to. Lasts all day, doesn't take your concentration, and also counts as making a spell attack for things like the Gloves of Battle Mage's Power, so it synergizes incredibly with lots of items. Just an absurdly powerful spell in terms of the consistent, solid damage output that you get from it. Spike Growth wins certain kinds of encounters entirely on its own. This is a gigantic AoE battlefield control spell that does damage when enemies move on it and slows them down. Against melee enemies or enemies who can't easily jump out of it, this is going to do hundreds of points of damage and also prevent them from ever attacking you. So there are certain kinds of encounters where you just cast Spike Growth. Mostly encounters where enemies have to move towards you for some reason, either being melee or because you can back up away from them, where you just cast Spike Growth and the encounter's over. This is maybe the most powerful spell at levels like 3 and 4 in the game, and one of the reasons that characters that get it, like druids, are so powerful early game is you can just win a bunch of encounters outright just by casting this spell. Spiritual Weapon is a bonus action summon that doesn't take your concentration and basically is free to cast except for the spell slot. Being able to summon something with a bonus action is really good. It will absorb attacks from enemies. It does solid, consistent damage. You can use it to block doorways and stuff. I go into the uses of this spell quite a bit more in the detailed spell tier list, but basically the reason that Spiritual Weapon is so good is that it's so cheap. Level 2 spell slots later in the game are not very pricey to spend, and a bonus action is often free for characters like clerics especially, who often don't have great uses for their bonus action. So it's effectively adding an entire extra turn to your party for free. And even if all it does is absorb 2 enemy attacks, that's a great use for a spell. Definitely check out the more expanded spell list, though, because I talk a lot more about how to get value out of Spiritual Weapon, because I know this is one that some people find a little less useful, but this spell is really good. In A tier, I have Flaming Sphere, Heat Metal, Invisibility, Magic Weapon, Moonbeam, Scorching Ray, and Silence. Flaming Sphere is similar to Spiritual Weapon, but takes an action to cast, but it's going to do a little more damage on average than Spiritual Weapon will, because it's a little more mobile and a little more consistent at hitting enemies. It spreads fire surfaces, which is really good at dealing just constant damage with no saving throw, and it will absorb a lot of attacks from enemies, because you can use it to block doorways, and they'll often attack it. So Flaming Sphere, similar to Spiritual Weapon, just makes your whole party more survivable and deal more damage. A great thing to be concentrating on, especially in the early game. Heat Metal can be very powerful, repeatable damage and disadvantage on attacks against certain enemies. It can also disarm them, allowing you to steal their weapons and stuff like that. Enemies will often waste their turns over and over. There are some bugs with the save DC on Heat Metal, which keep it from being an S tier spell, but the effect of this spell is very, very powerful. Invisibility is a great utility spell, letting you traverse areas you aren't supposed to be in and so on, but also a great combat spell. Invisible creatures can automatically trigger surprise rounds, causing enemies to skip their first turn, so you can use it to stun the entire enemy party. You can also use it on a character that is in trouble in order to prevent enemies from attacking them. It is a little worse for that usage than the potions, because you have to spend your action and concentration on it. But even then, the potions are still a very valuable resource, so sometimes you're better off casting a spell like Invisibility defensively, and it is one of the best defensive tools in the game. It's also an incredible offensive tool and useful for all kinds of story events, so most parties are going to want access to Invisibility in some form, whether that be potions or using the spell, and often the spell is the best way to do it. Magic Weapon is a great thing to concentrate on for characters that don't have other important things to concentrate on. So for Eldritch Knights or Arcane Tricksters in particular, this just buffs them up significantly. It also synergizes very well with Shadow Blade, which doesn't naturally have an enhancement bonus. Magic Weapon gives you a bonus to your hit and damage on the weapon, as long as you maintain concentration. And so that's a very powerful tool. Being able to hit more accurately and do more damage is, again, the main thing that you need in Baldur's Gate 3. So while this is an expensive way to get it, a level 2 spell slot and your concentration for the entire day, there are plenty of characters that don't need those spell slots and don't need their concentration. So for something like an Eldritch Knight or Arcane Trickster, Magic Weapon is often the best thing that they can be concentrating on, and a very, very powerful buff for those characters. Moonbeam is excellent, direct, repeatable damage. It's the highest damage output on average of any second level spell, dealing 22 damage every turn, because just like Cloud of Daggers, it triggers both when enemies enter the effect, like when you cast it on them, and at the beginning of their turn, so you're going to double up on the damage before they actually get to act. It also has some interesting synergies because the damage from Moonbeam doesn't count as coming from the player, so you can use this while Sanctuaried without breaking Sanctuary, which of course is broken, but then also you can use it in various ways where dealing damage from the player would be a problem. The main downside is that it's not AoE like Cloud of Daggers, but this is still just an amazing, repeatable, single-target damage spell, and sometimes you get more than one enemy in it, in which case it does an absurd amount of damage. Scorching Ray is your best direct damage option that's not concentration for characters that have access to it. It fires 3 beams, each of which can critically hit, and of course, like other spells that make multiple attacks, that makes it much more reliable because it tightens the distribution of damage. The average 21 damage that you're going to do is very likely to be around actually 21, because you're going to hit with, you roll a lot of dice, and so you're very likely to get damage numbers near the median. The other thing about Scorching Ray that is very useful is that it can critically hit because it fires multiple attacks, and it fires multiple beams, so you can apply on-hit effects with each of those beams. So there are builds like the Fire Sorcerer that are built around buffing each ray of the Scorching Ray up to incredible damage levels, so you can build around this spell, but it's also just a great spell to cast when you just need to deal damage. You can also split the rays across multiple creatures if you need to kill more than one thing. Finally, Silence is a ritual spell, so it's free to use if you cast it before combat begins, and enemy spellcasters can't cast most of their spells in the Silent Zone, so if you can keep them inside of it, it just lets you shut down spellcasters immediately. Those are often the game's most dangerous enemies, so Silence is very powerful there. Even more importantly, on Honor Mode, a lot of Honor Mode legendary actions require the boss to make noise, and Silence prevents that. So you can, with a ritual, so it doesn't cost a spell slot, shut down enemy legendary actions, which completely ends some Honor Mode boss fights or makes them vastly easier than they would otherwise be. So not only is this great against spellcasters, it's especially good on Honor Mode, where the spell does even more. Finally, a couple important spells to keep in mind at lower tiers. Calm Emotions is very good in any fight where Fear or Charm is in effect. It makes your whole party immune to those effects, so especially in the early game, there's a couple fights where Calm Emotions just shuts down the main mechanic of that fight, and you can win the fight very easily. And then Enhance Ability is very expensive for advantage on a skill check. A level 2 spell slot is not worth spending on advantage on most skill checks in the game, but if you really want to pass a skill check, this spell is really good for that, of course. So most parties are going to want to have it prepared and then try to avoid as much as possible actually casting it, because sometimes you'll want it, but it's very expensive when you're going to use it. But when you'd rather spend the spell than fail the skill check, Enhance Ability is still good. Third level spells are pretty much the biggest power spike that you get at any point when you're playing through Baldur's Gate 3, because these spells just win fights outright. When you hit level 5 and get access to third level spells, the game gets vastly easier, and a very common play pattern for spellcasters is going to be to cast one powerful concentration-based third level spell that just effectively ends the fight, and then just play cleanup with whatever spell slots you have remaining, and that's going to be true basically throughout the game. I should also mention before I get into the third level spells that if you've made it this far in the video and are enjoying it, I do daily videos with gameplay and guides to this game and lots of other games. I have hundreds of Baldur's Gate 3 builds on the channel, so, if you're an hour into the video already, feel free to hit subscribe and leave a comment, because that helps me out with the algorithm, so of course if you take the time to do that, I appreciate it. Third level spells, in S tier, I have placed Counterspell, Glyph of Warding, Haste, Hunger of Hadar, and Spirit Guardians. Counterspell is the game's most important defensive tool. Pretty much every Honor Mode party should try to have at least one character, and usually two, capable of casting Counterspell, because it lets you trade your reaction for the most dangerous thing that enemies can do in the entire game, casting high-level spells against you. Turning your reaction into the enemy losing their turn and in a very important resource, of course, is excellent. There's some subtleties with how to use counterspell. You want to use a spell slot of the level of the spell that the enemy is casting to guarantee that it works. A little more on this in the expanded spells tier list, of course. But basically, counterspell lets you turn your reaction into the enemy not doing anything for a full turn, which is incredibly powerful and costs them something that they really need, their high-level spell slot. Glyph of Warding is a spell that is a little tricky at first glance, because this looks like a spell that you're supposed to trap enemies with and wait for them to walk onto it, but it detonates if you put it on top of an enemy. So this is basically like a fireball that you can choose what elemental damage type you're using. Just like other sources of multiple damage types wrapped into one spell, this lets you bypass resistances and hit vulnerabilities easily. And, of course, it comes with cold or lightning damage, which can do ice surfaces, and can be doubled with the wet condition, which, of course, is incredibly powerful. Glyph of Warding also comes with the sleep mode, which is a non-concentration AoE stun that just puts enemies to sleep, preventing them from acting entirely, which, of course, is very powerful to be able to spam a non-concentration stun on the whole enemy group. This is one of the best spells to cast when you're concentrating on something else. Special mention with Glyph of Warding for Abjuration Wizards, because this is an Abjuration spell, so it will also restore your Arcane Ward stacks. Haste gives you a whole extra action. The game of Dungeons & Dragons can be basically summarized as trying to take as many actions as possible and trying to limit the number of actions that enemies take as much as possible. Increasing the ratio between actions you take and actions they take to infinite is how you win the game. Haste does that directly by just giving you extra actions. Doubling up on a party member's ability to do stuff is, of course, excellent. This gives you effectively a 25% increase in the overall capabilities of a standard party. On Honor Mode, you can't use extra attack with it, but you can still cast multiple spells, fire multiple Eldritch Blasts, for example, or reactivate the spells that can be activated turn over turn, like Call Lightning. So there are still tremendous amounts of ways to use the extra action economy from Haste. Just an incredible spell, and the best buff spell in the game. Hunger of Hadar wins encounters on its own. It's a no-save blind that also does damage and slows enemies. It's a gigantic AoE, so enemies will be stuck inside of it for a very long period of time. And as a Warlock spell, you're often getting this at a low cost, a Warlock spell slot, so you can use Hunger of Hadar to just win encounters instantly. This is some of the best battlefield control in the game. It also stacks immensely well with other battlefield control effects because it's a cloud, so it sits on top of them. You can keep them in it with a plant growth or a spike growth or something like that, and they'll consistently take the damage. And finally, Spirit Guardians is a cleric's go-to damage option. Being able to just run next to enemies and do damage to them, apply debuffs like the Radiating Orb item set, is excellent. This is, again, action economy free damage. So you cast it before combat starts, so it takes no actions on your part to use Spirit Guardians, and maximizes your movement. As I've said previously, every character gets 5 resources every turn of combat, of which movement is often the least used. Spirit Guardians turns your movement directly into damage to enemies, which is absurdly powerful, and also can be combined with your other powerful damage spells or just control spells like Command. A very common play pattern for clerics is run around with Spirit Guardians and cast Command every turn, in order to just win fights outright. In A tier for 3rd level spells, I've placed Animate Dead, Call Lightning, Fear, Hypnotic Pattern, Lightning Bolt, Mass Healing Word, and Fleet Storm. Animate Dead is the first access that you get to real day-long summons. You spend this spell slot and you just have an extra character in your party, or multiple extra characters, all day. The skeletons that you can summon with Animate Dead are solid, consistent range to damage output that can be buffed using spells like Crusader's Mantle or Aid from previous levels to be significantly more powerful, and they'll just consistently increase your damage over the course of the adventuring day. You also, of course, having more bodies on the field just gives you more tactical options. You can block doorways, you can channel enemy movement, you can place characters where enemies are likely to attack them. You can place them on the edge of crowd control effects like Hunger of Hadar to prevent enemies from leaving without taking attacks of opportunity. Animate Dead also has the zombie mode, which can just win certain kinds of fights outright because the zombies spawn more zombies. So if you're against a battle where there's lots of weak enemies and you can reliably summon more zombies, Animate Dead will win those fights immediately. At higher levels, you can summon the ghouls or flying ghouls. Typically with Animate Dead, I like to spend a 4th level spell slot on the skeletons, because you just get 3 skeletons to do consistent damage, and you want your higher level spell slots for more important things, but any way that you can use Animate Dead is going to give you a really powerful advantage for the entire day. Call Lightning is excellent repeatable damage. You can concentrate on it and it gives you a powerful ranged attack. You can repeat that ranged attack with haste and it's lightning damage, so of course you can double it by getting enemies wet and then they'll take double lightning damage. This is just a very efficient use of spell slot to damage return in longer fights. So in any fight that's going to go long, Call Lightning is just going to do way more damage than any other spell that you could cast. And it does so while also not costing you additional spell slots, because it just gives you a good action that you can take every single turn, making sure that your character always has something relevant to do. Fear, Hypnotic Pattern, and Sleet Storm I'm going to talk about together, because these spells often fill the same role. All of these are concentration-based AoE control spells that let you lock down all or large parts of an encounter at once. Fear is in a cone, and it's the most powerful debuff, but the hardest to land. Enemies hit by Fear have to run away from you and can't act for 2 turns, preventing them from doing anything, and that, of course, just wins fights outright. They only get 1 save against it, and no subsequent saves. So, if you can hit enemies with Fear, this is the best one to actually hit them with, because they fail 1 save, and the fight is over. Hypnotic Pattern is much easier to land, because it's a big AoE, but enemies can wake each other up. If Hypnotic Pattern can hit the entire encounter, though, it just prevents them from acting entirely, and they'll wake up dead because you'll attack them and kill them, which, of course, will just win fights immediately. So, again, these are spells that you're going to cast at the beginning of fights to lock down all or most of the enemies in an encounter and prevent them from ever acting, which will, of course, just win the encounter outright. Sleet Storm makes a gigantic ice surface, and we've talked about how good ice surfaces are. This is less reliable in terms of stunning than Fear or Hypnotic Pattern, because enemies, you don't get to know before the enemy turn whether they're going to fail a save and fall over, and sometimes they'll act before moving, in which case they won't stun themselves. But knocking an entire encounter prone is really powerful, and ice surfaces, of course, in Baldur's Gate 3 are broken. So Sleet Storm is, of the 3, the least reliable crowd control, but the most reliable spell, because it will almost always do something. Hypnotic Pattern is the easiest to land on a whole encounter, and if you do land it on a whole encounter, you win that encounter, and Fear is the most powerful if you can get an adequate number of enemies in it. All 3 of these spells are to be used at the beginning of fights to win them, and which one you use is going to depend on the fight, which is why I'm talking about each of the 3 together. Lightning Bolt is the best AoE damage spell at 3rd level. It's very easy to hit lots of enemies in it, and it's lightning damage, so it will often be able to be doubled by getting enemies wet. The line is a little bit worse than Fireball's Circle often, but in some encounters is going to be better, and the fact that it's lightning damage just makes Lightning Bolt significantly more powerful than Fireball overall, so it's often more reliable. Also, fewer enemies are resistant to lightning damage than they are to fire, which is why it gets the nod over Fireball. Mass Healing Word is a bonus action to heal your entire party with a Healing Word, and just like Healing Word, spending a bonus action to get allies up from prone or reapply the buff on heal items to your whole party is great. The Bless and Blade Ward that you get from the Buff on Heal item set, the Whispering Promise and the Hellrider's Pride, only last for 2 turns, so Mass Healing Word is the best way to reapply those after you have lost them. If the fight goes longer than you were expecting, very much worth a 3rd level spell slot. You're mostly using this for those buffs, but the extra healing that you get in addition to that is really nice. A couple notable spells from lower levels as well. Plant Growth is a non-concentration AoE spell that slows enemy movement speed to 1/4, which is really good at keeping enemies inside of AoE effects. Combining Plant Growth and Hunger of Hadar will just end an encounter immediately, because enemies will have to move at 1/4 speed, won't be able to jump out because they're blinded, which prevents enemies from jumping, and will just be stuck in the Hunger of Hadar forever. Slow is also a really nice debuff when you can't land one of the more powerful debuffs. While it doesn't entirely stop enemies from acting, it is directly targeted, so if you can't easily place an AoE debuff like Hypnotic Pattern without hitting your allies, slow will work just fine. And there's lots of bosses that are immune to the more powerful debuff spells that are not immune to slow, so in boss fights this can be very powerful. Very good to keep this spell in the back of your mind for when the other spells that you are using as more of a go-to don't work. As you can see, at 4th level, there are fewer spells in the top tiers, and this is a natural consequence of how spellcasting in Baldur's Gate 3 works, because these higher level spells are competing against every spell of lower levels. So often the best use for a 4th level spell slot is to cast a 3rd level spell upcasted, or even a 1st level spell. Commanding 4 creatures is often the best use for a 4th level spell slot, so keep in mind that you can always cast lower level spells as we go through. Nonetheless, there's still some very powerful spells in 4th level. So let's start with our 1 S tier spell, Conjure Woodland Being. So what does this spell do? The answer is, what doesn't it do? This is the most efficient summon to spell slot in the game. You get 2 summons for the price of 1, each of which can repeatedly cast lower level control spells, as well as being just pretty powerful characters in and of themselves. The Woodwode is a decent tank, and the Dryad has control spells, so you can cast Spike Growth and you can cast Entangle, and those spells, of course, are already really good spells to cast. You get so many abilities in addition to just having 2 more characters on the field for 1 use of Conjure Woodland Being. This spell gives you just an absurd number of tactical options. This spell is fairly close to getting an entire extra character in your party because it gives you 2 extra spell casts every turn, as well as the ability to have a decent melee fighter available. So you can really think of Conjure Woodland Being as increasing the power of your party by, 20% or something when you cast it for the entire day, as long as you can keep these characters alive. And you can also buff the Conjure Woodland Being summons, again, with all of the AoE buffs that multiply the effectiveness of your summons. In A tier, I've got 4 more spells: Conjure Minor Elemental, Greater Invisibility, Ice Storm, and Wall of Fire. Conjure Minor Elemental is another summon spell. It's certainly not as powerful as Conjure Woodland Being, but in particular, the ice methods give you, again, multiple spell casts every single turn of combat, because they can cast Chromatic Orb for ice at will. And so that's going to let you set up ice surfaces while dealing great, consistent, ranged damage. So these, again, just give your entire party a massive boost for the whole day. Usually I recommend summoning the ice methods. The mud methods and the azure are less powerful overall, though they do have their place in certain encounters or in certain adventuring days or party compositions, but you can never go wrong in Baldur's Gate by using ice or lightning, so whenever a spell gives you the option, that's usually a good default to pick. Greater Invisibility is like invisibility, preventing enemies from seeing or interacting with you, but you can also attack during it. Now, there is a playstyle that is built around maximizing Greater Invisibility that completely avoids ever entering combat, because as long as you can keep making stealth checks, you can stay in Greater Invisibility basically forever until all the enemies in an encounter are dead and they never get a turn. Obviously, that completely breaks combat in Baldur's Gate 3, but even if you aren't building around Greater Invisibility, this is still often 2 or 3 attacks before combat starts on a character that can make reasonable stealth checks, and then also you still get a surprise round. You can also do things that require you to interact with objects when you are Greater Invisibled, in which you can't do with just normal invisibility, which is useful for some story circumstances where you need to sneak around but also be able to act and do stuff, cast spells and so on. So Greater Invisibility is very powerful for characters that are built entirely around it, but also just a very good spell because you can get 2 or 3 free attacks before combat begins, and then also get the normal benefits of invisibility. And of course, anything that gives you free actions is going to be incredibly strong. Ice Storm is a powerful AoE damage spell. The damage from Ice Storm is okay, not amazing for a 4th level spell slot, but the big thing here is that this creates a gigantic ice surface, a 20-foot radius ice surface, with no concentration. Now, often Sleet Storm is going to be a better way to make an ice surface, but Ice Storm is good because it doesn't require you to concentrate on it, so you can do it while concentrating on something else. That something else could even be a Sleet Storm. So a lot of characters are going to be spamming Ice Storm, especially in the late game, in encounters with lots of enemies, because creating ice surfaces is, again, just an extremely powerful tool in Baldur's Gate. If an enemy walks on it, they might fail the save and just stun themselves, and that happens very consistently because enemies usually move before they take their action. So Ice Storm is often an AoE damage spell that also comes with an AoE stun. This is going to get a tremendous amount of value, but it's not as reliable as spells that directly stun enemies. So think of this as a way to potentially cost enemies actions, but don't rely on it to always cost enemies actions. If you really need to lock down an enemy, cast a control spell. But if you just want to hit a bunch of enemies for damage and also potentially cost them their turns, Ice Storm is great and doesn't require you to drop concentration on anything else. Finally, Wall of Fire is some of the game's best sustained damage output. If you can keep enemies inside the Wall of Fire, they take very consistent and very high damage every single turn. So in longer fights, this spell can do hundreds of damage. It also just wins certain kinds of encounters outright. If enemies have to move towards you through the Wall of Fire, they often will just take damage. Against lower health enemies, that can kill them immediately. And in fights that take place in a long hallway, you can place the Wall of Fire lengthwise down the hallway, forcing enemies to take multiple turns of fire damage just to reach you. So this spell can often just win certain kinds of encounters or certain layouts of arena immediately. It's also just great damage on any enemy who's locked in place. So if you can keep an enemy in place in the Wall of Fire with immobilization effects or with spells that slow them down, then they're going to be taking very powerful damage every turn, and then you also still have your action to do other stuff. So Wall of Fire, just constant excellent damage that also wins certain kinds of encounters just by itself. A few notable spells from lower levels here as well. So Banishment, Freedom of Movement, and Guardian of Faith, I mentioned are all spells that are featured in my video, The 5 Most Underrated Spells in Baldur's Gate 3, that I posted relatively recently. So for a much more detailed explanation and demonstration of using each of these, you can refer to that video. But basically, Banishment targets a charisma save, which enemies often have very low charisma saves. So against certain enemies who have much higher wisdom than charisma, this can be the best way to lock down those enemies. Freedom of Movement not only gives you the day-long buffs, it also snaps an ally out of a stun, so it can be a great panic button if an ally gets stunned, and that also works on if you drop concentration on haste, Freedom of Movement will snap that ally out of the lethargic debuff as well. Guardian of Faith is just big, so it can be used to absorb a lot of attacks from enemies, block doorways, and so on. Confusion is also worth mentioning because because Confusion doesn't hit allies, so if allies and enemies are very tangled up, this is an AoE control spell that can be very useful. You can also use it and then just leave, and enemies will often attack each other because they're confused. So this spell can do a lot of damage if the enemies have nothing to hit except for one another. Level 5 spells get a little bit thin in terms of actually casting 5th level spells, because these are competing against 4 other spell levels, and a lot of spells at level 5 are pretty weak. And so it can be very important to know which ones are good and which ones are bad at this level, because that will help you avoid spending your spell slots on spells that don't do that much. In S tier for our 5th level spells, I've placed Conjure Elemental and the secret spell, Curriculum of Strategy, Artistry of War. Conjure Elemental is both a level 5 and a level 6 spell, because it has 2 modes, and it is a day-long summon and the best summon in the game. The Myrmidon summon is the most powerful summon overall, so when cast with a 6th level spell slot, Conjure Elemental is almost entirely equivalent to adding a full extra party member to your party, because the Myrmidons are just so powerful, and of course, multiplying the number of actions that your party has, each individual unit that you add to your party is more powerful than the last, because they will combine together in ways that make each of them more powerful, and also because it gives you a greater and greater advantage in terms of the number of actions that you're taking compared to the number of actions that enemies are taking. So when you have a really powerful summon like this, not only is it individually very strong, it makes all of your other party members better because it divides damage across your whole party and lets you burst down enemies faster before they get to act. So Conjure Elemental is just amazing. All 8 of the modes for Conjure Elemental, because you can cast it at level 5 for an Elemental, or at level 6 for a Myrmidon of each of the 4 elements. All 8 of the possible modes are good, and I highly encourage you to experiment with which one is the best for your particular party composition. As always in Baldur's Gate 3, choosing the cold or lightning versions of a summon or a spell is always a good default, so you can use the air or water elementals, and those will always be great, but all of them have their place in certain party compositions and in certain encounters, and there's 8 possibilities here, so I very much encourage you to play around with it and see which one you like the best. Artistry of War is a secret spell. It can only be received by finding a scroll of it in the world and then learning it as a wizard, and it's basically a gigantic magic missile. It has all the advantages of Magic Missile. It's incredibly reliable, so it doesn't miss, it can shoot around corners, but it does a tremendous amount of damage, and doing tons and tons of damage without rolling dice at all is obviously absurdly strong. So Artistry of War has all the advantages of Magic Missile, but also comes with a truckload of additional stopping power, which lets you kill enemies with it extremely reliably. In A tier, we have Destructive Wave and Hold Monster. Destructive Wave is only available to Light and Tempest clerics, but it is an extremely powerful AoE spell. And importantly about Destructive Wave, although it says it deals damage to all creatures within 30 feet of you, it actually only damages enemies, so you can very safely use this around your party. It does relevant damage and very high damage and knocks enemies prone. Doing Radiant and Thunder damage are both very important damage types in Baldur's Gate because they have a lot of synergies with certain items, and it doesn't take your concentration. It knocks enemies prone, which can often keep them inside of your Spirit Guardians for longer, so Destructive Wave is just a great way to blow up a whole encounter. Casting this spell will often just deal enough damage and knock over enough enemies that cleanup afterwards is very easy. Hold Monster, of course, is the same as Hold Person, but can target many more enemies. Now, this makes it significantly weaker, it's significantly weaker because it takes a much higher level spell slot. So even though the effect is better, you would much prefer to use Hold Person in encounters where that's available. But sometimes it's not, and the effect of holding person or monster is so ridiculously powerful that spending a spell slot 3 levels higher on exactly the same effect is still a great use of that spell slot. Obviously, when you have hold person available, you're not going to cast hold monster, but against enemies that aren't persons, hold monster is identically as powerful and will let you just blow them up right away. One big difference is that because this is a 5th level spell slot, the maximum number of enemies you can hit with it is 2, because each of Hold Person and Hold Monster get an additional target whenever you upcast it, whereas Hold Person can target up to 5 characters, which will often just win the entire encounter outright. So Hold Monster is going to less often just shut down a whole encounter when upcast, but against powerful bosses, against enemies that are particularly dangerous, or against any enemy that you just want to blow up, Hold Monster will just end the fight immediately. And finally, one other notable spell from level 5 that's worth talking about specifically is Cone of Cold. While this is very expensive, it's a lot of direct damage, and especially for a cold and ice themed party, of course it's going to deal double damage. It can set up ice surfaces because it freezes everything under it, so you can again get stun effects, but although you won't often want to spend a 5th level spell slot just on AoE damage, if you combine Cone of Cold with other AoE damage effects, or with more Cones of Cold, you can layer 2 of them on top of each other and just one-shot a whole encounter. By grouping enemies up with the Black Hole Illithid power, or with Minor Illusion as a spell, you can have 2 characters cast Cone of Cold and just one-shot everything if you get them wet first. It's also important because this is available to Hexblade Warlocks, so you can cast this using a Warlock spell slot, in which case it's very powerful because it's not costing you any more important resource. So Cone of Cold is really important for characters like Hexblades that don't otherwise have access to good AoE, and when layered with other AoE, can be the most efficient way of instantly ending an encounter. And of course, 6th level spells are the most powerful spells in the game. Most characters, absent ways to refresh these spell slots, only get 1 per day, so what you want from a 6th level spell is either to gain a massive advantage in every fight across an entire adventuring day, or for it to just win one very difficult encounter by itself, conserving your resources for every other encounter that day. So the best 6th level spells either win one fight outright, or give you a huge edge in every fight so that they can affect the entirety of your adventuring day enormously. In S tier, I have 2 6th level spells, plus of course the third one that is Conjure Elemental, which is a 5th level spell, but often cast at 6th level because it has a different and unique effect, which is extremely powerful when cast as a 6th level spell. The first of these is Globe of Invulnerability. Globe of Invulnerability makes everything in the radius completely immune to damage for 3 turns. Baldur's Gate 3 combat is mostly about doing enough damage to kill the enemy before they do enough damage to kill you, so 3 turns of complete immunity to the game is obviously ridiculously strong. Most combats will not last longer than 3 turns, and so Globe of Invulnerability will pretty much single-handedly win whatever encounter you cast it in, as long as you maintain your positioning inside the globe and consistently deal damage to enemies. One other great thing about Globe of Invulnerability is that it's a concentration spell, but it's very tough to lose concentration on it, because the way that characters lose concentration on their spells is typically by taking damage, having to make a concentration save, and failing it. You can't take damage when you're in the globe, so you are very unlikely to have to make concentration saves, so you're very likely to get the full value of all 3 turns of Globe of Invulnerability. There's also a lot of fights that this spell is particularly powerful in. Boss fights where enemies have one big attack that you need to avoid. Globe of Invulnerability just completely negates that. And arenas where the arena itself is a threat because it does damage to you in some way, you can ignore that as well because you're immune to all kinds of damage. There's also a bunch of synergy with effects that deal damage to yourself. When you're immune to that damage, you can use those effects with impunity. It keeps your summons alive. You can deal consistent damage with Guardian of Faith with it as well, because while it normally takes self-damage, it doesn't when it's in the globe. So there's lots of synergies with being immune to damage, but also you're immune to damage. Obviously, that's good. Hero's Feast is a day-long, non-concentration buff that makes your whole party have advantage on wisdom saves, gives them extra HP, and makes them immune to fear. There's lots of fights in the late game where you need fear immunity, because the fear effects are pretty dangerous, and Hero's Feast lets you ignore those completely. The extra HP is very powerful, stacks with the extra HP from Aid, and advantage on wisdom saves makes you significantly better at avoiding one of the most common ways to lose honor mode runs, failing a dangerous wisdom save against a spell like Hold Person that the enemy can then just one-shot you with. And so Hero's Feast makes you significantly more resilient to those kinds of effects. It also has a bunch of synergies because it makes you immune to poison, and immune to the poison damage effect of Cloud Kill, so a character with Hero's Feast on them can stand in their own Cloud Kill and things like that. But mostly this is just a day-long buff that makes your entire party vastly more resilient. It also, of course, works on summons, so if you have any summons in your party, you multiply the effectiveness of Hero's Feast across all of the summons that you have in your party as well. For clerics, this is usually going to be the best usage of their 6th level spell slots. Druids are going to spend their 6th level spell slot on Conjure Elemental, because I think, in general, if you're only casting one of these day-long buffs, the order goes Conjure Elemental, then Hero's Feast, then Planar Ally. But for most clerics, this is going to be the best way to spend your 6th level spell, and of course you can refresh that spell slot using the items that let you refresh 6th level spell slots. Hero's Feast can also be cast by a camp caster, a character that stays behind and, casts day-long buff spells and then stays behind in camp. But even if you cast it with your active party, this is an incredibly powerful buff and very much worth spending a 6th level spell slot on. It makes every fight throughout the entire day so much easier and safer. In A tier, we have 4 spells: Chain Lightning, Otto's Irresistible Dance, Planar Ally, and Wall of Ice. Chain Lightning is the go-to direct damage spell for just blowing up a whole encounter. It is very easy to target because the arcs will go between up to 4 creatures, and it will spread out across the whole encounter very easily. So you're going to get an enormous amount of damage across 4 different enemies when you cast Chain Lightning. Of course, it's lightning damage, so if you're a Tempest Cleric, you can maximize the damage, and with the wet condition, you can double the damage because lightning damage in Baldur's Gate 3 is just that powerful. So being able to just blow up an encounter with Chain Lightning, of course, will end it immediately. Similar to Cone of Cold, Chain Lightning is best in multiples. Characters that can cast Chain Lightning multiple times, or having multiple characters that can cast Chain Lightning in your party, can just end encounters by one-shotting them before the enemies ever get a turn. The most common way to cast this spell is actually with an item with the Markaheshkir's staff that lets you cast it once per short rest, but even if you spend an actual spell slot on this, Chain Lightning is still going to be a ton of damage, and again, the criteria for 6th level spells is either they should help you a lot in every encounter or win one encounter outright. There's some encounters that Chain Lightning just wins, and so obviously it's going to be worth casting in those. Otto's Irresistible Dance is irresistible. When you first cast this on an enemy, they get no saving throw against the effect, and they always lose their next turn. Subsequently, they get wisdom saves to try to break out of it. But a no saving throw stun that just trades your turn and your spell slot for the enemy, with a chance of keeping them locked down for longer, is of course incredibly good. Anything that has no saving throws in Baldur's Gate 3 is always worth looking at, and Otto's Irresistible Dance will let you shut down the most dangerous enemy in an encounter, no questions asked. The other great thing about this spell is that, like some other stuns, the enemies that are immune to disable effects are often not immune to Otto's Irresistible Dance, so you can use this even against enemies that you otherwise can't cast Hold Person or Hold Monster or other disabling effects on. Autos will work on them, and in any encounter with just one strong enemy, that will just win the encounter outright. Planar Ally is also an extremely powerful 6th level summon. Overall, the Planar Ally summons are a little weaker than the Myrmidon summons, but you're still getting a very powerful ally when you use Planar Ally. So if you have a spell slot left, or if you've used an item that lets you refresh your 6th level spell slots, having the Planar Ally summon can be very powerful. Of the 3 summons, the Djinn and the Deva are much, much better than the Cambion. The Djinn is a little better for crowd control, and the Deva is a little better for damage, and they're both really good for tanking. The Cambion isn't good for anything, so you shouldn't summon it, except with the Infernal Rapier when you get it for free. But the Planar Ally summons are just very powerful. They're very tanky. They have good armor class and high HP totals, so you can use them to absorb a lot of damage from enemies without dying, and then heal them back up. And they deal consistent damage and consistent disruption to enemies. Very powerful tool. Again, a slightly worse summon than the Conjure Elemental summons, but still a 6th level summon, so still really, really good. Wall of Ice is secretly the best AoE damage spell in the game. So not only can you use this sort of as intended as an upgraded Wall of Stone that also does a bunch of damage on initial cast and comes with an ice surface, so it'll knock enemies over. There's also a secret second mode when casting Wall of Ice, because it does the cold damage when you initially cast it, and of course it's cold damage, so again, can be doubled, etc. It makes an ice surface, so it knocks enemies over and can keep stunning them. But then it also does cold damage when enemies enter the clouds left over when the Wall of Ice segments are destroyed. It leaves a cloud of freezing gas that does 10d6 cold damage again. And then again at the beginning of the enemy's turn, if they start their turn in that gas, they take 10d6 more damage. So you can deal up to 30d6 cold damage with one cast of Wall of Ice if you cast and then immediately destroy it. You can do that easily by casting it and then just ending concentration on it manually, and so this can be the biggest burst damage for any spell in the game. In addition to that, it also can be used to knock enemies prone, block AoEs and stuff, but mostly you're using it for the very, very powerful burst damage effect. You do have to be fairly precise with the casting because the clouds are a little bit smaller than the segments of the wall, so you need to overlap them with enemies to get the full damage of this effect. And there are some bugs with the save DC of Wall of Ice, which prevent it from being S tier because it's a little less reliable because the casting interface is a little awkward, and there's bugs with the save DC that make it have much lower DCs than it's supposed to. Unfortunately, Wall of Ice, Wall of Thorns, and Blade Barrier all have significant bugs that make their save DCs lower than they're supposed to be. But Wall of Ice is still really good, even if it does half damage, because the damage on the immense burst that it does is so incredibly high. No spells from lower tiers here that are particularly important to mention specifically, but of course if you want more information on the lower tier spells, then you can refer to my expanded spell tier list where I talk about every single spell in the game in great detail. And that's true not only for the spells that we discussed in S and A tier, but also all of the spells in lower tiers as well. So if you're curious about why I placed any of the spells where I placed them, definitely go check those videos out. They're linked in the description. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at all of the very best spells in Baldur's Gate 3, from cantrips all the way through level 6 spells. And I hope that it helps you make sense of this very complicated system and build your characters in a way that makes them more powerful. If you just picked spells from the 2 tiers that I mentioned, your honor mode parties would do great. Of course, you can get more value from spells of lower tiers, and I definitely don't want to stop people from casting those when they find them fun or in the circumstances where they're good. But this should give you a great baseline to work off of in terms of the power level of the spells and where they fall in terms of their efficiency for the spell slot and what you get out of them. Of course, for more detail, you can check out the expanded spell tier lists or my literally hundreds of build guides on this channel to specific classes and the ways in which they're going to use these spells most effectively. And of course, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to leave a comment of any kind, hit the like button. That helps me out with the algorithm, so I really appreciate it. YouTube has also added the feature where you can hype videos, which I still genuinely don't know what that does, but pushing buttons is always great, so feel free to push those buttons. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Also, of course, if you disagree with my placements of any of these spells, definitely let me know in the comments below. I'm always open to moving things around, though you may find more information and more reasoning in the expanded spell tier list, so I recommend listening to the entry on that spell if there's something that really jumps out at you as maybe being misplaced. Go listen to the entry on that spell in order to get perhaps a little more context, and then if you still think I'm wrong, definitely let me know. Very interested to hear your opinions. Alright, my friends, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.